This is a bit of a different video than what I normally upload. However, if you've been following me on Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook, you may have already seen a photo or two. But over the last month or so, I have been carefully selecting parts for a new PC build. Now, a couple of days ago, I put the whole thing together, and today I wanted to explain to you the reason behind picking certain parts over others, as well as show the build process itself. The ultimate goal for this PC build was to be able to do gaming, video editing, video rendering, and live streaming all at the exact same time. Now, my old PC wasn't necessarily bad, but it was starting to show some age. For example, I was limited to streaming at 720p at 60 frames a second, I was starting to drop frames quite heavily in newer titles in particular, and I had the feeling that my motherboard was slowly running into more and more issues. And besides that, of course, since I do upload these daily YouTube videos, I was spending about an hour to an hour and a half every single day rendering out the videos, which essentially means that I can't use my PC during that time. And obviously, better and newer hardware is going to be vastly superior in that process. As is the case with most builds, I also decided to get started by installing my CPU on the motherboard. Now, the CPU was most definitely the most tricky part for me to choose. I've been weighing the options of the i9-7900X and the Threadripper 1950X for about a good month or so, looking at all the different benchmarks available. However, eventually I decided to settle on the i9 instead. Now, on paper, the Threadripper 1950X is indeed the superior choice. However, for my specific use case, I decided to go with the i9 because both of the chips would be absolutely able to crush live streaming, and the i9 would simply give me better performance in-game. Now, of course, you gotta keep in mind that this is a very specific use case. If you're gonna be buying either an i9 or a Threadripper for primarily video games, you are honestly just simply wasting your money. For most workstation tasks, the Threadripper is just simply going to be superior. And if you are going to be mostly playing video games, you are probably better off buying a Ryzen 5, a Ryzen 7, or maybe a 7700K or the 8700K once it does release. However, since I am indeed gonna be playing video games as well as rendering and live streaming at the exact same time off of a single PC setup, I figured that the i9 was the way to go because a lot of the games that I personally play on a daily basis, such as for example StarCraft 2, they are just simply not optimized for multi-threaded workloads. As far as the motherboard goes, I decided to go with the Asus Strix X299E gaming motherboard, even though it's got gaming in the name, which I personally don't really like all too much. It has all the features that I need, and it's got great reviews as well. For RAM, I decided to go with 64GB of Corsair Vengeance at 3000 MHz, just because I did regularly fill out 32GB on my old PC, and even though 64 may sound like a bit of overkill when you are editing and rendering videos on a daily basis, it does make a difference to have more. Next up is a part of the PC build that I had never installed before, and that is an NVMe SSD. Essentially what that means, in case you are unfamiliar, it's an SSD that plugs directly into the motherboard. The fact of the matter is that if you normally install an SSD, it's gonna run all of its data through a little cable that gets connected to the motherboard, and this one is essentially plugged directly into it. Now, it is indeed significantly faster than a regular SSD. I am personally using it for my operating system, my main applications, as well as the main games that I play on a near daily basis. And while I did have some troubles installing it, it turns out that my motherboard actually has got a heatsink. I had to loosen up a bunch of screws and I had to install a standoff and whatnot. After I installed it, everything has been running super smoothly since. The next part in assembling this PC was indeed to take apart the case. Now, since I am indeed going with an all-in-one liquid cooler that we'll go over in just a little bit, I was a little bit worried that it wouldn't perfectly fit, in particular from previous experiences. Now, I decided to go with the H440 from NZXT in matte black. I've already made a PC, my previous PC was actually in an H440 as well, however that one is in a glossy white instead, which looks pretty awesome. But regardless, I already had built a PC before in the H440 case, and I knew that it was going to be a very tight squeeze. So I ended up removing 4 of the hard drive disk bays, just because it should improve some airflow as well as create some more room for me to install the radiator in. Next up is the power supply unit. Now, I wanted to go with the EVGA Supernova at 850 watts. However, a lot of you recommended to me on social media that I should really consider looking into the Seasonic Prime Platinums instead. So I decided to go with that one because it seems in 2017 they are absolutely crushing the benchmarks. Now, for some odd reason, it came in this really velvety sort of pouch, which was a little bit unnecessary, but I did decide to install the PSU before anything else into the case, just because the case that I'm running does have a bit of a shroud, a bit of a coffer for the power supply unit. Now, since this is a fully modular power supply unit, I did decide to plug in a couple of the cables before stuffing it into the case. I connected the 24-pin one, the 8-pin connector, the SATA connector, as well as a PCIe connector for the GPU. And in typical fashion, as always, when you use a fully modular power supply, I ended up forgetting one of the important ones. Next up in the assembling of this build is the part that I was most nervous about, just because of my previous experience with the H440 case. Now, I decided to install the CPU cooler, at the very least the radiator, before putting in the motherboard. Just because it runs two 140mm fans, it's roughly a 30cm long radiator, and you're working in a very tight space. I figured that it would probably be easier for me to go ahead and install the CPU cooler before the motherboard itself. And it turns out that indeed that was the right choice. Now, I decided to go with the NZXT Kraken X62 RGB. I know, that's quite the mouthful right there. It's rather expensive for what it is, though, I'm not going to lie, but it is doing a great job at keeping my CPU cool, and it's actually very quiet as well for an all-in-one liquid cooler. Now, the i9s are indeed known to run very hot, but under full load while doing live streaming, rendering videos, and playing games all at the exact same time, I have yet to see this CPU cooler bring my CPU over 60 degrees Celsius, which is most definitely very nice. Now, I started off by mounting the fans to the radiator, after which, of course, I had to mount the radiator to the case as well, which is a little bit of an annoying job. I mean, you gotta make sure that you hold it in place while not damaging the pump, and, you know, of course, making sure that you route the cables from the fans to the back of the case, but everything worked out reasonably smoothly. Next up is installing the motherboard into the PC case itself as well, and I almost made the classic PC builder's mistake of not installing the backplate first. However, I saw it out of the corner of my eye while already lifting up the motherboard, and I of course did install the I/O shield first and foremost. Next, I could finally install the motherboard itself as well. I made sure, of course, that it lined up with the I/O backplate as well as the standoff screws that were already pre-installed. After securing the motherboard into the case, I could finish up the CPU pump installation, and of course, the pump itself is connected with a couple of tubes to the radiator, and to the radiator, of course, we already mounted the fans, which will essentially get rid of the heat. Now, the nice thing about this CPU cooler is that the thermal paste was already pre-applied, and after installing the pump, of course, I had to route some cables from it to the motherboard, such as, for example, the CPU fan header, as well as the USB header, which is one of the special features of the CPU cooler, I suppose. And last but not least, of course, I had to make sure that I removed the plastic coffer on the pump, which is one of the, one of the most satisfying moments with this mirror-like finish. After that, I decided to wire all of the cables from the power supply unit to the motherboard itself. Now, one of the things that I personally did not really keep in mind when selecting all of the parts is that I am building a matte black computer inside of a matte black case. So I needed to make sure that I had a flashlight nearby to make sure that I could actually see if everything was mounted incorrectly. Now, the downside of installing a radiator first is that you are indeed dealing with very, very tight spaces, but everything just barely worked out properly. I installed all of the PSU cables like I mentioned, and I also connected all of the case headers to the motherboard itself. At this point, essentially all of the tricky parts of building a PC are behind us. All I needed to do now is install the graphics card. Now, I decided to go with the GTX 1080 Ti, essentially the best consumer-grade graphics card on the market right now, and of course, I decided to go with NVIDIA as well, just because I do make use of the CUDA acceleration when rendering video on a daily basis. I decided to not go with any SLI setups just because, once again, I primarily play Blizzard games, and Blizzard games don't really like SLI all that much. But the installation of the graphics card was pretty straightforward. All you really need to do is pick the PCIe slot that you want to plug it in, plug the graphics card into that slot right there, and then connect it to the power supply unit by using some of the PCIe cables. Honestly, building a PC is almost like playing with Legos at this point. It is pretty straightforward. The only problem is that it's rather expensive Legos, but it's pretty easy, to be honest. And now we have arrived at the scariest and most exciting point of building a PC, and that is the very first boot up. If everything is done successfully, it should spin up with relative ease. However, if you made a slight mistake, of course you can be troubleshooting for the remainder of the week, essentially. Now, I grabbed a monitor, I grabbed a mouse and keyboard, hooked them up to the computer, connected the computer and the monitor to power, flipped the switch on the power supply unit, and then I pressed the power button on the computer. Now, of course, as you may have noticed, I did not decide to build the PC first outside of the case. I immediately jumped into the deep end of the pool, but as soon as I pressed the power button, the fans went on, the LEDs went on, and while I realized that apparently I did not properly connect the case fan connector to the power supply unit, about 30 seconds afterwards, I did see the motherboard screen with information as well, and it went straight into the BIOS. At that point, of course, a huge sigh of relief. I ended up installing Windows, which quite literally was the fastest installation that I have ever seen. It quite literally took 3 minutes. It turns out that NVMe drives indeed are pretty efficient, but at that point, we are essentially good to go and install some of the drivers. However, before doing so, I wanted to make sure that I got the old drives out of my computer as well. So I grabbed the 2TB SSD that I've been using for video production for a little while. And I also grabbed the 4TB hard drive disk that I've been using for archiving instead. I installed those also into the case. And while at this point it was indeed rather tricky to connect them to SATA and power, it all worked out perfectly. Now, I personally don't really care too much for cable management for the cables that are out of sight, so as long as the side panel closes, I was pretty happy about it. I decided to take the computer upstairs, connect it to my monitors, connect it to all of the other USB devices that I've got over here. I pressed the power button once more, and I did not get anything on the screen. Now, this is a part of the build that I quickly want to brush over because it's honestly one of the most frustrating experiences that I have ever had while building a PC. It took me until 4 in the morning, about 8 hours or so later, to figure out what the issue was with the help of a friend. At that point, I was already feeling like throwing this entire machine out of the window. The RAM was not properly detected. Half the time it would not be able to turn on the computer at all. And it turns out that while testing the computer downstairs and installing Windows downstairs, I used an HDMI cable. However, for some odd reason, while installing the PC upstairs, I did not get any display over the DisplayPort adapters that I usually use. In the end, it turned out to be nothing more than just simply changing a BIOS setting, which essentially disabled the use of DisplayPort adapters for some very odd reason. But ever since I changed that BIOS setting up, a couple of days later right now, everything has been running perfectly. Render times are about 2 to 3 times faster than my old PC. I can stream flawlessly right now at 1080p, 60 FPS while having perfect frame rates in game as well. And everything has been working like an absolute charm. I hope you enjoyed this bit of a change of pace on the YouTube channel. If you did and you haven't already, make sure you hit that subscribe button down below so you get a notification as soon as future videos go live as well. But other than that, I want to thank you very much so for watching. Have an amazing day. Do not forget to smile, alright? And I will see you in the next one.